Alright, crafting system. Coming up, let's go. We set up a query inventory system last time so that we could now set up a crafting system. So we're going to write the code for all that and set up our first crafting recipe. So let's start by creating the crafting recipe because we can't make anything if we don't have a recipe, right? So we're going to make a struct for that first and foremost. So blueprint, structure. And this will be our struct crafting recipe. And in this struct, we're going to do something a little bit weird. Because the struct is only going to have one entry in it, and that'll be the actual recipe. And you might be thinking, how do we do a recipe with one value? Well, the way we do that is by creating a map worth of items. So we have our BP item here. And then instead of just a variable, we're going to make this into a map. And the value for it will be an integer. So this way, we'll be able to add as many items as we want and the amount that we need for the recipe. So this is not going to be a shaped crafting system like you see in a game like Minecraft. It's more going to be along the lines of the more popular survival games where you just need to have them in your inventory and then you can click on a button and craft it in a crafting menu. And you might be thinking, why did we need to make a struct for that, right? Because that seems a little bit stupid. That is because every single one of those is going to be a recipe in and of themselves, of course, and we're going to store all of those simply in a data table, just to have a central place to keep all of those things. And in order to make a data table, you need to have a structure for the data table to take. So this will be the str crafting recipe data table, and we'll call this data table crafting. And in here, we can start adding whatever we want. So we can add our first entry and we can name that row something. The row names don't really matter, but let's call this damage potion. That's the thing that we're going to be making here today. And the recipe for that will be, number one, we'll take a health potion, just one of them. And then number two, we'll also take in some rocks and we'll take 5 rocks to make that. Now, we can set this up in a number of different ways. We can go back into the struct and add in a second map here that will be the resulting items. And I think that is the easiest, most procedural way to set this up. You can do this on an individual basis in like your UI widgets and stuff like that, but we're going to be doing it like this. So this will be the resulting items. And the wonderful thing about it is because it's also going to be a item map with integers, is you can return multiple items, multiple different items very easily with this. Now, do keep in mind that that might lead to some issues with the inventory getting overfilled, and you might need to build in protection for that if you end up having crafting recipes that return more items than they take in. For the most part, the idea behind crafting is that you get rid of some items and then get less items back that are better. So generally probably not going to be an issue, but something that you might want to take into account. So let's go into our items here and the item assets, and then I'll just copy over the health potion that we already have. We can just duplicate it and we'll call this damage potion. And this will do the exact opposite of a health potion, images. So let's say damage potion. And then with that, we're going to change the icon. I also added in a icon for this because I really felt like we needed to. And I made a damage potion icon as well. And this is going to be taking off 10 HP instead. And the resulting item from the recipe that we just made in our data table, so health potion and 5 rocks, is going to be just 1 damage potion. So we add in a damage potion and we set that to 1. So now that we have one recipe added to our data table here and we have everything set up, let's go into our inventory components, which I think is just in a root here, and add a function for crafting. We already have our query single slots and query multi-slots. We're going to be using the query multi-slots for this crafting system. So let's make a new function for craft item, and let's capitalize the I there properly so that it's a little bit more readable. And this is going to simply take in an input for a crafting recipe. So we'll take in the recipe, and that will be of type, of type recipe as well, like crafting recipe. There we go. And we'll just craft these one at a time, much like we have in the inventory system itself, where we are adding and removing items one at a time. You can adjust things to make them allow you to add multiple at a time, but that does create potential for like overflowing item stacks and that kind of stuff. So I personally prefer to just add them one at a time and just add them on a loop. If you're gonna have a game with items that could iterate millions of loops in that way, you probably don't want to do that, but most games won't run into an issue like that. Anyway, so when we get that recipe, we just break it and we get the recipe and the resulting items. And the first thing we want to do is we want to check the resulting items and whether or not there is enough room in our inventory left to add those items in. Now, you can make this very easy or very complex. What we're going to do is we're just going to get the keys from this and we'll check the number of keys that we have, the length of that. That is the amount of items that we're going to be getting back. We're just going to look into whether or not we have that many empty inventory slots. You could do something where you also iterate through and see, hey, do we already have a slot with this item? And if so, does that slot have enough room in it to get these items in it as well? But that then creates potential issues with stacks that might be able to take part of it in, but not all of it in. And it's just a lot more bothersome to set that up. If you really need that to be the case, that is the basic rundown of how you do that. But for the most part, just checking, hey, do I have enough empty inventory slots is probably good enough. So that requires us to have a function that returns the amount of empty inventory slots. So let's make that real quick. Get empty slots amount. I don't know, something like that. Which we'll add a return node for, and the output will be the empty slots, and that will be an integer. And they will just get the inventory array, do a for each loop over that array. We'll make a local variable here just to count. Honestly, we can just like call it I or something, but count is a little bit more descriptive. And they will just set the value of count to increment. So we can actually just use the increment function for that, increment integer. Whenever we see that this array element has no item. So we get the array element, we break it, we add in a branching node, and when that is false, we add 1 to our count, and that's going to be our entire for each loop. And then at the end of the for each loop, we complete, and we just return the count. So this is a very simple, easy function to let us know, hey, how many slots do we have that have no items in them? Which again is why I like having this has item bool. You can very much just like check whether or not this is equal to 0, but that leaves you open for like mistakes a little bit more. And also requires you to do this 0 check every time you want to check whether or not something has an item, rather than just having a bool for that. So that's why I like having that around. So now that we have that function, let's go back into craft item, which is what we were working on. And we can just get the empty inventory slots and we can check, hey, is this less than or equal to the length of the amount of items that we're going to be getting back? Putting in here during the editing, I obviously made a mistake, and it's a very easy mistake to make. A mistake that you probably make all the time is I put these in the wrong order. So now it's checking the empty slots amount. If that is less than or equal to the length, which is not what we want to check whether or not this is greater than or equal to. So we check greater than, or rather actually greater than or equal to. Or you can just put these two pins around, but this makes it a little bit more readable. So greater than or equal to, not less than or equal to. Easy mistake to make. I make it all the time. And if so, then we move on to the rest of this function. If not, we don't even need to attempt to craft anything. We don't even need to look if we have the recipe completely in our inventory or not, because we're not going to be crafting anything anyway, because we don't have the inventory room for it. So there we can return. And I suppose we can add like an enum or a string at some point that can maybe give a little bit of feedback for early returns, because we're going to have a few different ones here, but we'll probably circle back to that a little bit later. Assuming that we can fit our newly crafted items into our inventory, what are we going to do then? Well, we're going to get the keys from the recipe now, because we need to look whether or not the recipe itself is actually viable. So instead of having these noodles go all over the place, we can just get recipe, because it's also a local variable when it's an input like that. We can split that structure pin and we can just get the keys that way. It's a little bit cleaner. And once again, we're going to be doing a for each loop over all of that. So now we're going to use our query inventory. So we can actually just pull that in. And we can check the item to find and the amount of items that we need to find. So the item to find will be the array element, because this map has 2 columns to it. Number 1 is the keys, which is the items that we're looking for. And then it's the values, which is the integers, which is the amount. So we can just use the key as a item to find, and then using this same recipe map that we have here, we then use the find function, and we're going to be finding the key that is in the for each loop. So that we're looping over all that, and that's going to return the value integer, which is just the amount of items that we're looking for. And we're going to be doing that for every item in the recipe. Now, if at any point we run into a scenario where the items were not found, so we don't have enough items of any particular type in our inventory to do this crafting, doesn't matter if we have half the items, we need all of the items. So if this is false, we are going to again early return. Just cancel out of all of this stuff. We don't need to move on. We're just adding a return there. Now here we're going to do something slightly weird and tricky. Even though we don't know if we have all of the items yet, because we're just looping through the items to query the inventory, we're already going to be removing the items that we want to use to craft. And that is because it is easier to keep track of the items that we have removed and add them back in if it turns out that we can't fully craft this thing, than it would be to put those items to the side and then pull them back in once we are sure that everything is all right. So what we're going to be doing is, if it has found the items, we have these inventory slots that the query inventory gives us, which, as a reminder, is a slots array of just the slots with those items in them. And for that, we're going to make another one of these, let's call this slot counter variables. And before we go into this, we do want to make sure that we always set this to 0 as the first thing that we do. Now that we have all of that, we can get a reference. It's important that there's a reference for what we're going to be doing in a moment to the inventory slots that we're going to be removing things from first and foremost. First thing we're going to do is we're going to use the remove item function that has lived on our inventory forever. And we're going to be running that the same amount of times as we need to remove items. The way we're going to do that is with a for loop, not a for each loop, just a normal for loop, where the index will start at 1, the last index will be the return value here of the finding node. We'll hook that up to the true value of the branch, and then in the loop body we'll just remove the item. But, and this is the funny thing, is because we are just passing in an item slot that we're going to be finding on the inventory itself, the inventory slots that we're getting here is a separate array that exists in this function. It's not actually the inventory itself. So if we remove something from the inventory, it's not going to be removed from the corresponding slot in this array. And that's a little bit annoying about how we set that up. But it's also not that big of a deal, because since we have this as a reference, we can also just set a member in inventory slot. And the member that we're going to be setting will be the stack size. And the stack size will be equal to the stack size that we had. So we're going to break this simply just -1. And after we set this, we're going to check whether or not that stack size has decreased to 0. So we're going to, once again, pull off of this stack size. And we're going to check whether or not this is now 0. Because if it has become 0, the stack is now empty. And we don't need to do anything about setting the has items and like clearing out, because this is an entirely temporary array anyway. So the only thing that we really need to do is we need to get our slot counter and just increment that so that it starts looking at the next slot. If we are in this part of the code anyway, we know that this bool is true, so that the inventory as a whole has enough items to do this part of the crafting anyway. But that's just for the first item. It goes through this for every single item in our recipe. So what if we end up in a situation where we had enough of the first item, but then when we start removing things from the second item, we find out that, oh no, actually, this was bad, because we don't actually have enough of this second item to finish the crafting, but we've already removed everything from the first item. So we're in a bit of trouble. And that's why we're going to be keeping track of the items that we have used, so that if we need to take a step back and refund those items, we can. So we can simply add in another map here, and that will be our items used map. And this will be just like the other maps that we've had. This will be the BP item type for the keys. So that's just BP item object reference. And then we'll make that into a map, and the value will be integers. After we figure out, hey, the items we found, that's okay. Like this slot, the amount of items, this item, the amount that we need, we have. Because we have that bool check right here. When we find that out, we're just going to get the items used, a map that we just made, and we're going to be adding to it. And what we're going to be adding is we're going to be adding the item from the for each loop. which as you recall is the keys from the recipe map. And then we're also going to be using the recipe map again. We already added in a find node for that. So we're going to also find the amount that corresponds to that, and we're just going to add that as a new entry. So when we are sure that we have enough items in our inventory to do at least this part of the crafting recipe, we're going to be putting that into a temporary holding map, just so that if we need to backtrack and we need to like refund those items because later down the line it turns out, hey, actually we can't really do that, we can just add those items back in. Speaking of which, let's just do that. So if we go through any part of this for each loop and we query the inventory and we figure out, hey, actually, slight issue, this returns false. That's not exactly what we want. Then we're going to put in some other code. This is going to be a little bit of a mess here for a moment. After the series is done, I'm going to clean up all of this just like I did with the first part of the inventory series, comment everything nicely and upload it to the Patreon page and for YouTube members as well, so that you can download it. For now, it's all going to be a little bit messy. The final project is going to be a lot more clean. Anyway, pulling off of this false node, what we're going to do is we need to check down the items that we have used. And we're effectively going to do the same thing here. So we're going to get the keys from the items that we've used. And we're going to be using that for a for each loop. And this is just as easily as, hey, we've removed them from the inventory, so we don't need to be doing any checking on whether or not they can fit back into the inventory, because there's literally no way to remove them, do something else, and then have them returned. Because this is all going to happen in a split second, in like an instant, within a frame. So we simply just say, hey, everything that we just removed, I'm deeply sorry about that. We're going to just add them back in. So we'll just add item, and the item to add, we'll just do that. And we will do that in a for loop again, a normal for loop, not a for each loop. For each loop is the default one that it selects, but you want to do a normal for loop. First index will be 1, and the last index will be our items used once again, and we're going to be finding the corresponding item, and that will then be the last index. So that's going to be adding in the amounts that we removed to begin with. And that'll be in the loop body for that. And it's going to be doing that for every single item that we just removed. And after we have done that, we do another early return, because we didn't have enough items to craft after all, and we don't want to move over the rest of all of this. So again, when we early return, it also aborts whatever we are doing within this loop. And that is important because that means that it's not going to run whatever code we put into this completed section. So if it manages to remove all the items, it means that it's found all the items. There's enough of all the items because this never ran. So on this completed, we're finally going to be adding the new item to our inventory, which is effectively just kind of the same thing that we're doing here. So we will, from our crafting recipe, which we can copy from any random place, because again, it is just the input parameter here, we're going to get the resulting items. And you'll not be surprised to say that we're going to be using the keys for that. We're going to be putting that into a for each loop. And then honestly, we're just kind of going to copy this, which is the for loop, the add item, and the finding node, because it's exactly the same thing. We'll use the finding from the recipe resulting items. The array element is going to go into that finding node as well. And then the array element is going to go into the add item function. And that is effectively the crafting system all working and set up. So again, there's quite a lot going on with all the noodles going all over the place here. I am going to clean this up so that everything is a little bit more readable. And now let's actually add in some debugging information as well, because we have got a couple of early returns here that might not fully make sense to you. So if it doesn't work, what you want to do is you want to add in a new string, and we'll just call that a debug string. Now, every single one of these return nodes has this little string in it. So we can see, hey, there's not enough inventory space, so not enough space. And then this one is a early return for one of the items was lacking. And then I guess at the very end here, what we can do is we can also return, and this one will just be crafted. But for now, let's just go ahead and test this. I think the easiest way to set this up is just going into blueprints, into my third-person blueprint, and just add a quick little debug key. So let's add a debug key F. And what we'll do is we'll get the normal inventory component. It should be noted that because this is all done through the inventory component itself, it will not take into account multiple inventory components. So if you have something in your hotbar, or eventually maybe if we go into an equipment system, into like your equipment inventory, it's not going to sample that and it's not going to be able to see that and use that in crafting. I think that is probably desired behavior. It not yanking it out of your inventory for like your hotbar or your equipment. If you do want that, you can probably figure out how to do that on your own. It's just a matter of creating something that takes in an array of inventory components and then querying all the inventory components there, which is effectively the same thing that we did in the inventory query video at the end there. Anyway, so let's try to craft an item. We're going to be trying to find a recipe here. So we can actually, and this is quite fun, we can just make up a recipe on the go as well. We don't need to only use recipes that exist in that data table, because we can just literally like make a map, and there we can see, okay, we want to create a thing here where we take in the health potion. Like we need 10 health potions for this. This is not going to be stored anywhere. This is just literally a one-off recipe that you can make. So maybe if you have like a specific crafting station that crafts a specific type of weapon that takes a specific thing in, and you really don't want to just deal with having that in your data table for whatever reason, you can still do it this way. But we're going to be doing this with a data table because it's just the way that makes the most sense. So we get the data table row, and there we can just get in a data table, which will be our data table for crafting. And that'll just have your drop down of all the rows in there, and it'll just be our damage potion. If it can find that row, we'll go into craft the item, and it will be able to find the row because, again, it's just through a drop down. The out row will go into the recipe, and yeah, that's pretty much all there is to now crafting items. And now that we have that, we can, after the actual crafting, we can add a print string and just print the debug out string that we had there. So now we can like pick up these potions from there. Those are potions because I don't have a model for them. I picked up a sword as well because why not? Let's pick up some of the rocks from this chest. And now if I press the I key to open the inventory, I think we should be able to craft even with the inventory open. And there we go. We removed 5 of the rocks. We removed 1 of the potion and we got 1 of this potion. So now if we try that again, we should get a second potion. And if we try it again, nothing will happen and it says 1 of the items was lacking. There is an issue here with attempting to access a index out of range. And that is because we are trying to remove an item multiple times in a row there. And it doesn't really hinder functionality, but it's a thing that we probably should take care of anyway. So in the remove item functionality, what we're going to do is we're going to check, hey, the inventory array here, we're going to check if whatever we find is a valid index. I'm going to be putting that into a branching node. So if it is a valid index, we'll just move on with the rest of this function. But if it is not, we won't be doing anything. And then the index that we get is the index that we find. If it doesn't find anything from your inventory component with the item that you supply in, the index that it will give is -1, because that's an index that is never possible to get. So it's not accidentally going to access something that's not supposed to. But it will sometimes result in that weird error that we saw a moment ago. And actually, while we're at it, we kind of over-engineered this little bit that we have here. Because since this is a decrementer anyway, we don't actually need to set the value of it afterward again. Because it's decrementing a reference. So we can just do that all immediately like that. And that will also improve any potential errors that you might be having. So now with all that, if we just pick up those potions again, we pick up the rocks from here. I open the inventory and I press the F key. You see no more errors, but the functionality still fully works and we can't craft more than we have the items for. So technically speaking, we have a crafting system. We have no way to interface with it yet, but that's going to be a thing that we do next time. We're going to be making a crafting menu. We're going to take everything in our crafting data table and we're going to be putting it into a crafting menu. And for the full course, if you're watching this in the future, it should be all up on the YouTube channel already. But if you're watching this shortly after it was uploaded, there will be a link down below in the description to the Patreon where you can find the full course. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page. A huge thank you to my Cave Student tier supporters, Earl Monseval Erno, and my Cave Digger tier supporters, Sir J. Thomas,